In this episode of UI Experiments, we go crazy and build this 3D flip-out navigation with the help of a handy CSS property called Perspective. Hey everyone, Michael here. Welcome back to Dev Café. What we're going to be building here is this 3D flip-out navigation. Now, there are two things happening here when I click this hamburger icon. The first one is this sort of a navigation drawer that opens up like a door on a hinge almost. And the second part is the main viewport, or the page itself, sort of sliding out of the way and then rotating to create this three-dimensional look. To achieve this effect, we're gonna be using a CSS property called Perspective. I've been doing CSS for probably like 8 years now, and this is not a property that I've used often. In fact, I think I've only used it once in the past. So I myself needed a little bit of a refresher before I got started on creating this. So let's just dive into some code here and start laying out the page, and then I will dive into the CSS Perspective property as soon as we get to the part where we actually have to use it. Alright, so as usual, I have an empty VS Code project, and we're gonna start with our trifecta, an index.html page, the style.css page, and an app.js file as well. Now we're going to use a little bit of JavaScript here, and most of this will be appending a class to the body. So actually that's probably the only part that we'll be using JavaScript for. The rest of this effect will be created with HTML and CSS. I'm going to open up my HTML file, and we're going to use Emmet here to generate our bare bones template for HTML. For the title, I'm going to put in just 3D CSS navigation. First thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to link up the style sheet. So I'll put in link CSS, and it's going to just automatically link up my style.css. Next, I'm also going to drop in some fonts from Google. I'm just going to paste this in from my finished project. So here. And by the way, all of this final code will be in the description down below. So if you want to follow along with the code that I already have, just hit the link in the description and download it. Next, I'm gonna just make sure to link up my app.js file, the script, and then we're gonna do src app.js. Next, let's template out the page itself. So first thing I'm gonna have on the page is a div with a class of main wrapper. And this is going to make more sense once we get into the actual implementation of the Perspective CSS property. But for now, know that we're going to have a wrapper around the whole page. Next will be a header tag with a class of navbar and container. So what this is basically this sort of a nav bar. If I right click and inspect, what you'll see here is that this sort of invisible nav bar that's 70 pixels tall, and inside of it is just a button which will activate our menu. All right, also let's serve this page up. So I'm going to open it up with Live Server, and voila, there it is. Perfect. In another tab, I'm going to have the actual final result so that we can reference it as we build out this page here. All right, so after the header tag, we're going to have a button with a class of menu button, and it's also going to have an ID, which will hook into our JavaScript with btn, same name as the class. And then inside of there, we're going to have a div with a class of hamburger, which will be our hamburger menu icon. So next we'll have the main tag. It will have no class on it. Then we're going to have a section tag with a class of hero. And this will be the section with an image down below. Inside of the hero section, we'll have a div with a class of container again. And then inside of there, we're going to have an h1 tag that says visit Iceland. Next, we'll have another section tag with a class of info. Inside of there will be another container tag, or a div with a class of a container. And this is going to be this section down below that just has some lorem ipsum text. Let's put in an h2 here. Say, look forward to an Icelandic adventure. And then let's put a p tag in here with maybe 20 words of lorem ipsum. Down below, we'll put another p tag, and this will have 40 words of lorem ipsum. Save that. Great. Actually, let's do another lorem 20. There we go. I like that. So hit save. Great. Nice and ugly. Just the way we want it. And lastly, we're going to have a wrapper div, which is here. So I'm going to collapse this. We're going to create a nav tag with a class of nav drawer. The nav drawer tag itself also serves as a wrapper for the inner nav. And again, I'll explain why I'm doing this once I get to explaining the concept behind Perspective CSS property. Inside of this nav tag, we're going to have a div with a class of nav drawer inner. And then inside of there will be a button, which will have a class of close btn. It's also going to have an ID that is the same, and we're going to use this for our JavaScript. Down below will be a UL tag with an li, and then inside of here we're going to have an anchor tag with an href that goes nowhere, and this is going to be one of our nav menu items. Now let's go ahead and make some copies of it. And this one, we're going to change the text to tours. This one, we'll say hotels. Let's capitalize that. And this last one, we'll say contact. Let's capitalize that too. Okay, that's it for HTML template. It's nice and simple. Just some main content as well as the nav drawer. So this is what it looks like right now. And let's jump into the CSS and get this thing styled. All right, so as usual, I'm gonna start with some basic resets. I'm gonna do a margin of 0. We're gonna do a padding of 0. And we're going to do a box sizing of border box. Oops. Box sizing. Next, I'm going to set up some variables that'll help us keep things consistent and reusable. So, variables. We're going to have a variable called navbar height, the value of 70 pixels. This is that navbar I showed earlier. We're going to have another variable, nav drawer width. And this is the width of this black navigation drawer. And then lastly, we're going to have a transition length of 0.6 seconds. This is just a transition will apply to all of the transitions that are happening so that we have a consistent length and timing of all transitions. All right, so let's just get into some general styles here. We're going to give the body a font family. And this is that Google font that we imported, Merriweather, serif. Next, we'll give it an overflow X of hidden, or actually, we don't even need this. We just do an overflow hidden. And I'll explain why we're giving a body an overflow of hidden. And it has something to do with that wrapper container that we created. Let's do a transition of background color. And we're gonna use our variable transition length. And then we'll do an ease in out. And the background color transition will happen when we open this. You'll see that this, if you draw your attention to this gray part, and then when I close it, it goes back to white and back to gray. So we'll also be transitioning the background color, and that's why I'm putting that here. So that's it for now. We'll leave the body where it is. Then we're gonna style that main wrapper, which wraps all of our main content, so the hero section and the info section down below. It's gonna have a height of 100 view height, and width will be 100 view width. So we want it to be always the size of the viewport. Overflow will be auto, and then transition will be transform bar transition length, and also ease in out for the easing. Next will be the main section, and this one's just going to have a background color of white. Next one here is just the general container elements, and it will have a padding of 0 and 2 rems on the left and right. All right, so next let's style that 70 pixel tall invisible navbar. Navbar, it's going to have a height of navbar height. It's going to have a width of 100%. Top will be 0. Display will be flex. Align items center to center everything vertically. Z index will be 1. And then position will be fixed so that it stays at the top of the screen when we scroll up and down the page. All right, so that's it for the navbar. Let's see how things are looking. Still ugly, but better. Now for this part, so these will be the two menu buttons that I have. So I have this hamburger icon and then this X for closing the nav drawer. I decided to make all of these with just pure CSS. It's pretty simple, but there's just a lot of repetitive code. So I'm just gonna paste this over from my CSS that I have prepared here. The links to the code, as I mentioned earlier, are in the description. So feel free to just grab that from the code in the description and paste it into your code as you're following along. So I'm gonna grab a whole bunch of CSS here and just paste it in here, and we're gonna title this section menu buttons. And these are really simple. They're just, just some classes using the before and after pseudo selectors to create those lines, and then do some rotation on the close button of those lines. So with that out of the way, let's style our hero section. So the hero will have height of 700 pixels. It'll have a background image, URL, and then this is just an image I grabbed from Unsplash. So I'm going to paste the URL in here, just like that. So we'll have background repeat, no repeat. Background size will be cover. Position relative. Color of the text will be white. Display flex. Align items center. Justify contents will be center as well. Next, let's style the hero after. And the after will actually be an overlay. So as you see, like the text kind of blends in with the background. And so what I have here, if you look at the final result, is this semi-transparent overlay that's over the top of the image, so that when you put your white text on top of that, the text stands out more. Just a simple design trick. All right, and as you see also, we've got our buttons all set up here. So we'll say position absolute. We'll say left 0, right 0, top 0, and bottom 0 to stretch it edge to edge. Contents will be just an empty string. Background color will be black. And then we're going to give it an opacity of 0.3. Just dark enough to make the text stand out. Now the text is still behind this thing, so that's why it looks gray. So let's fix that. Hero container. And we're going to give it a z-index of 1 so that the text goes on top here. Let's style that h1 tag. Font size will be 3 rems. Letter spacing 0.6 rems. I'm gonna space out these letters here. Now let's get to the bottom section here that has some info. So put info. I think I titled this one hero. Yep. Info. Gonna have a margin of 3 rems, top and bottom, and 0 left and right. Display will be flex, and justify content will be center. All right, next is the info section h2 tag, and that'll have a margin bottom. Actually, let's see what this looks like now. Okay, so we've got the text with some margin there. So let's make this happen. Margin bottom will be 1.5 rems. Text align will be center. So that should center the text. Info paragraph tag. Info paragraph. Max width of 900 pixels. Margin bottom will be 1 rem. Line height 2. And text align center as well. All right, so that should style most of the page for us. Yeah, I think that looks fine. We still got our scrolling, even though we put overflow in the body, but because we have this container wrapper, it still has scrolling, so we can still scroll up and down the page without a problem. Next, we're gonna style the nav drawer. And this is this guy here. So this black nav drawer with a close button in it and some nav links. Let's see, we're gonna target nav drawer. It's gonna have a width, which is a variable that we created up top called nav drawer width. It will have a position of fixed. It's going to have a top value of 0. It's going to have a bottom value of 0. And it's also going to have a left value of 0. It'll have a height of 100%. And initially, its z index will be -1 because we're going to want to have it start out behind the content so that it doesn't block anything from being clickable on top of the content. Let me show you what I mean here. So like initially, right, we want this drawer to be completely out of the way so that anything we click on here doesn't get through to the drawer. So we're gonna place it behind the content by giving it a z index of -1. Now the inner part of it, so this is the inner container inside of the nav drawer. Nav drawer inner, and it will have a position of relative. It'll have a height of 100%. It'll have a width of 100% as well. It'll have just a color of white. It'll have a background color of black. Transition of transform bar, and then we're going to do our standard transition length, and it'll be an ease in out animation curve. It'll have a top and bottom padding of 5 rems and left and right of 0. A box shadow. I did not come up with this. I just used a box shadow generator to create these values. I can never remember how to do box shadow stuff. It's just too many values in the right order and I just get confused every time. So I just use a generator typically to create these things. Display flex, and then align items will be center. All right, now we can't see it yet because we give it a z index of -1. So I'm going to comment that out for now just so we could see it. And we still don't see it. Oh, well, that's because we're in the wrong screen. Now we see it. Next, let's style these links down here. Nav drawer UL, and we'll do list style of none. Text align will be left. Font size 2 rems, and margin left and right of 2 rems as well. That looks better. Now let's style the li elements. So nav drawer UL li, margin bottom of 2 rems. Boom. Lastly, the nav drawer UL li anchor tag, and it'll have a color. Well, it'll inherit which will be the white color. What did I do wrong? Oh, square brackets. Silly, silly me. There we go. And text decoration will be none because we want to get rid of those underlines. Okay, that's better. It's not gonna have a hover state, whatever. This is just a demo. We don't need to make it perfect. Now, this is going to be our, so right now, with exclusion of this z index -1 that we've commented out, so let me comment that back in. This is what it looks like when it's closed, right? This is the state that we want to be in when the navigation menu is closed. Now, we're going to create our open state. And so the way we're going to do this is we're going to append a class of is-open to the body. And whenever that class is on the body, we're going to style those elements slightly differently. And then the CSS transition will take care of the actual animation. And we're going to apply this is-open class with the help of JavaScript, which we'll get into in a little bit. But for now, let's just put in, let's just call it open state. So body, so first thing is we'll do body.isOpen. The first thing we're going to transition is the background color, which we're just going to transition to this RGB value of 32. 32 is like a dark gray-ish color. Now, so that should take care of the background color of the body. Now, the body is open class, and then we're going to target a nav drawer. And this will control the z index of the nav drawer. So instead of z index of -1, it'll now get a z index of 1. So that's it for that one. And then body is open. We'll have a nav drawer of inner. And that one will have a transform form rotate y of 0. What did I do wrong again? Oh, these brackets. Okay, here we go. And then lastly, we're going to do body that is open. And then we're going to say main wrapper. And this is that wrapper that we created around all of our content that's going to do this sort of a three-dimensional, like, move to the side, rotate effect. And it's going to do a transform. And it'll rotate y along the y-axis by -25 degrees. And then it's also going to move out of the way, so it'll be translate x. And then that's going to have a variable. And then we want to move it basically the same width as our nav drawer. So we'll use our nav drawer width as the value there. Okay, so that should take care of our open state. All right, so let's experiment a little bit here with the state. I'm going to use DevTools, and we're going to target our body, and we're going to add that isOpen class to it. And as you see, I added it, and something happened here. We have a transition happening. Now, it's not quite what we want. It's not that 3D rotation that we want. And so this is where I think it makes sense to kind of pause for a second and go to this example that I created to better explain what's actually happening here. Now, what I've got is the simple code pen, which I'll link down in the description below so you can mess around with it and sort of explore how this CSS perspective property works. But what we have here is just a simple page that has a div that is this red outline, and I'm calling it a frame. And then we have the subject as well, and this is that inner box here with a blue background. Now the frame is kind of, this is at least for me, this is the most helpful way to think about it, is that when you're looking at an object, you're kind of looking at it through like a frame. Think of it as like a camera viewfinder. Every HTML element that you see on the page typically is going to be two-dimensional. So if I try to rotate something, so let's say I gave this subject, so this blue box, a hover state, and I'm just rotating it by 80 degrees. Now, if you see when I hover, it's kind of looking like it's rotating, but it's really mostly looking like it's just shrinking, like it's just being squished together. And the reason for that is because, as I mentioned, this is a two-dimensional object, and so the best way that I can think of it is like if I held a piece of paper. So if I had sort of, I'm holding this like notebook or this two-dimensional object kind of, and if I took a light and I was shining this light directly on this object, and on the other side on the wall I had a shadow that is being cast by this object. If I just rotated it, the shadow on the wall would not look like it's actually rotating, it would just look like it's shrinking. And so this is exactly what's happening here, is we're taking a two-dimensional object and we're trying to rotate it, but in reality it looks like it's just being squished together. So what we can do here, and as you see I commented it out, is add something called perspective. And the way that perspective works is you want to add it to the parent element. And this is kind of the tricky part, and it took me a little bit to figure out how to use it, is you don't add the perspective property to the actual thing that you want to rotate on or transform in a 3D space. You add it to the parent, or in our case, the frame, and then anything inside of it will basically get 3D context, or in other words, it'll have a third dimension. So we're going to add perspective 1000 pixels, and what the 1000 pixels does is it controls the depth, or the distance from which you are looking at the subject. So in our case, we're saying, hey, take the subject, keep it where it is, but then let's move our perspective 1000 pixels out so that we're looking at it from 1000 pixels away. And that's basically all you need to achieve an actual realistic looking rotation like this. So now the subject has a 3D space in which it can rotate. If I switch this to, let's say, 10 pixels, as you see, this effect becomes a lot more exaggerated. Like, it's basically, we're now only 10 pixels away from it, and so if we rotate, we're looking at it like this close to our face, basically. In our case, I just went with 1000, and it just doesn't look like it's moving. It's far enough to where that effect is not super exaggerated. Now there's one other thing we can do, is right now it's rotating around its y-axis, but it's just, the rotation is happening at the center. So we could do transform origin, just like with any other property that we can transition, and I could say left. And so now the rotation is happening, or the pivot is right on the edge here, so it's kind of like a door opening. If you think of this having like a hinge, it would just be opening. And then we could also put it on the right, and then it would open this way. That's pretty much it. Like, that's all you need to know to make the rotation happen. And let's take what we learned here and apply it to our project. Okay, we're back in our VS Code project. Now, before we dive in and start applying the perspective, I do want to write some JavaScript here to activate these buttons so that we're not constantly having to use our dev tools to apply the open class to the body. So let's do that now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to cache our UI elements, and we're going to have the body itself. So body. Next, we'll have the menu button, or the hamburger. And then last will be the close button. Next, we'll have handler functions. So one will be to open the menu. The other one will be to close. So handlers, we're going to create a function, call it open menu. Basically what we're going to do is first we're going to check if the body does not have a class called isOpen on it already. We will apply that class. So we'll say body dot class list dot add isOpen. So that's it for the open menu method, and then the close menu method will be very similar. So actually it's going to be similar enough so where basically I can copy this, and this one will first check if the body contains this class. It will basically remove it. Probably could have made this one method and just passed it like a value, but you know what? For simplicity's sake, it can be two separate methods. And then lastly, we'll have the event listeners, and these are the click handlers that will actually activate these, or that'll actually call those methods above. So we'll say documents that add event listener. We're gonna have a callback in here where all of the magic will happen. So in here we'll have a menu button that add event listener. We'll say click, and then it'll have an event, which we probably don't even need to tap into, but whatever. And then we'll just say open menu. All right, so let's check that. As you can see, it's opening. So now let's implement the close so that we actually close the drawer. So I'm going to refresh that. Let's go back to our code here, and we'll do close button, add event listener, click, and we'll do close menu. So let's try that. Beautiful. It's opening and closing, so our click handlers are working. So that's pretty much it for JavaScript. We're not going to touch this file anymore. Now let's go back to our CSS and actually get things to rotate in three. What am I doing with my hands? We're going to get things to rotate in 3 dimensions. First thing we're going to try to do is get this thing to sort of flip out like a door. And we'll do that by placing the perspective property on the actual nav drawer itself. So we'll say perspective. Now, because the nav drawer element itself is actually the parent, right? So the thing we're going to be rotating is this here, but we have to add the perspective property on the parent element, just like we did on the frame in that simple example that I just showed. So let's just say 1,000 pixels as well. That seems to be like a good number. Typically, it's far enough to where there's no weird warping happening to the element. So let's see what happens when we do this. So it's still not rotating, and the reason is because once it's actually clicked, we need to rotate it. So what we're gonna do is take the inner elements, which is this nav drawer inner. Initially, it'll have a transform of rotate y 100 degrees. Now, the reason it's 100 degrees is just a number that I came up with that kind of gives me a good starting point, I guess. I don't know if it needs to be that necessarily. It could be maybe 90 degrees. So 90 degrees will basically make it completely flush. So you can't even see it because it's literally like right dead center. So it's almost invisible. If I did like 91 degree, so you can see like a part of it, but if I do 90, it's completely gone. Let's see what happens when I click now. Great, we don't see it anymore, which is good. The other thing we need to do is also give it a transform origin, right? Because we want it to transform from the left so that it has that sort of a like a door and a hinge type of effect. So we'll do transform origin left. Let's see what happens. So we've got, it is not working. All right, so I found a little bug here. What I did is I put, instead of body, targeting the body element, I put dot body. So I had to remove the dot here, and now when I click, so now we've got our nav drawer removed. And again, what we did here is we simply added the perspective class to the nav drawer parent element, and then in here we kind of gave it an initial rotation of 90 degrees so that it's like completely invisible. We gave it a transform origin of left, which allowed our rotation to happen from the left side. And then when the isOpen class is applied to the body, we are basically transforming it so that it has no rotation, so it goes back to its like two-dimensional look. And then the transition is kind of taking care of that whole animation and timing as well. Now there's one last part that we need to do, and that is this cool looking 3D rotation of the body itself. Because as you see right now, it's kind of doing that shrinking thing where it's just looking like it's being squished together when we rotate it. So let's do that. The thing we're going to be transforming, actually, I'm sorry, we don't need the perspective on the main wrapper class. We actually need it on the body, because the main wrapper is what we'll be transforming. So we'll be transforming this here and anything inside of it, and then the body is the thing that's going to have the perspective. So that's the parent. So we'll put perspective on the body, and let's see how this looks. All right, it does what we want. And that is because earlier I applied, so when isOpen is on the body elements, we are rotating it by 25 degrees, and we're also taking the width of the drawer and shifting it over to the left. And the reason I'm doing that is because if I made this small, right, we want to make sure that this gets out of the way, because if I didn't have this, what we would have is this overlapping effect where basically the drawer just kind of overlaps the content, and even though it still rotates, it just doesn't really have the same effect. So we want to make sure it gets out of the way as well, like this. So now we've got this sweet looking effect. That's it. Thank you so much for following along. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you have any questions or comments, just leave them down in the comments section below. If you enjoy this type of content, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.